She buried her husband on a Tuesday. That was the first thing people always got wrong when they told the story later. They said she had time to grieve, that she stood at the grave for hours, that she wept until her knees gave. The truth was she had 40 seconds between the moment the Varath soldiers crested the ridge and the moment she had to run. 40 seconds to press her forehead to the cold soil, to say his name twice, and to pick up her youngest, who was 3 years old and did not yet understand why his father was lying down in the dirt. Her name was Mara Solen. She had been queen of a border province on a planet that no longer had a name. The Varath Dominion had recatalogued it as Sector 9 Kale when they annexed the outer ring of settled worlds 7 years prior. The original name, Tessivar, had been struck from all official records and replaced with an administrative designation. You were not supposed to call it Tessivar anymore. Mara had never stopped. She ran into the forest at the edge of the settlement with her 3 children. Alden, who was 11 and already had her father's jaw and her mother's habit of going quiet when she was frightened. Corin, who was 8 and had not stopped talking since birth, and compensated for terror by narrating everything happening around him at volume. And Lena, the youngest, who was silent in Mara's arms and stared back over her mother's shoulder at the column of smoke rising from the village with wide, dark eyes. The Varath had come for the queen. They had been coming for queens and kings and elected councils and elected anyone for a generation. They did not believe in human governance of human worlds. They believed in administration. They believed in order. They believed, with the deep and unflinching conviction of a species that had never in its recorded history lost a war, that humanity was a problem requiring management rather than a people requiring respect. Mara did not think about any of that while she ran. She thought about the children's feet. Alden was wearing the boots she'd mended twice at the left heel. Corin's laces were loose on the right. Lena had no shoes. Mara had scooped her up too fast. She would need to find cloth to wrap the girl's feet before the cold came in from the valley. She thought about shoes because if she thought about anything else she would stop running, and if she stopped running, her children would die. They reached the deep wood before nightfall. The old growth on Tessivar's northern continent was ancient in a way that even the Varath catalogers had noted 1,000-year trees with root systems wide as houses, their canopies interlocking so completely that the sky became a rumor between the branches. The Varath had standing orders to clear it for mineral extraction. The orders had not yet been carried out. Mara had known this. Her husband had known this. They had planned, in the vague way of people who hope the worst won't come, that the forest was an option if it ever did. He had died before the worst came, 3 months too early. She found the supply cache he'd built into the hollow of a tree whose roots had grown into a natural alcove. 2 sealed containers of dried protein, water purification tabs, a folded emergency tarp, a small power cell, and a handwritten note in his uneven scrawl. If you're reading this without me, you already know what to do. Love, Tomas. Corin asked what it said. Directions, Mara told him. She built a shelter that night from the tarp and fallen branches, wedging it between 2 root structures that rose like walls on either side. She wrapped Lena's feet in strips cut from the emergency cloth she found under the protein containers. Alden helped without being asked, moving with a quiet efficiency that made something break cleanly in Mara's chest, because her daughter was 11 years old, and she was moving like a soldier already, and that was not supposed to happen to an 11-year-old girl. Corin talked through the entire construction process, which helped. He described each action as they took it, provided running commentary on the angle of the roof tarp, suggested improvements that were largely impractical but delivered with such confidence that even Alden smiled twice. Mara let him talk. Talking was how Corin processed fear, and fear was healthy. Fear meant you were paying attention. She sat with them until all 3 were asleep, Lena curled between her siblings, Alden's arm thrown protectively over her sister without any conscious decision to put it there. Then Mara sat in the dark and allowed herself 5 minutes to feel everything. She counted them out on her fingers. On the first minute she acknowledged the grief, which was a physical thing, a pressure behind the sternum that made breathing mechanical rather than automatic. Tomas had been her partner for 15 years. He had been competent and funny and occasionally infuriating and had never once in 15 years failed to know when she needed silence and when she needed to be talked to until she laughed. She would never see him again. She pressed her thumb to the inside of her wrist, where she had worn the bracelet he'd given her at their bonding ceremony, which she had taken off and placed on his chest before the soil went over him because he would have wanted it. On the second minute she assessed the physical situation. 3 children, 1 adult, forest shelter, 5 days of food if rationed, no weapons, no communication equipment, no transport. The nearest resistance contact was a woman named Fen who operated a legitimate supply run business through the Eastern Valley settlements. 3 days walk in the direction away from the Varath perimeter markers she'd seen when running. On the third minute, she mapped what she knew about Varath search patterns. Thermal tracking through dense canopy was limited to a 40-meter radius. Acoustic sensors were effective but required stationary deployment. Ground teams moved in 6-unit formation, and their standard sweep radius from a confirmed last sighting was 12 kilometers, which meant they were currently inside the sweep zone and would remain so for approximately 18 hours before the search pattern expanded outward. On the fourth minute she thought about her children, not strategically, just thought about them. Alden's jaw, Corin's voice, the way Lena had looked at that column of smoke without flinching, processing it in complete silence. They were already shaped by her, all 3 of them, in ways she was only beginning to understand. Whatever she did next would shape them further. There was no option here that didn't mark them. There was only the choice of what mark she left. On the 5th minute, she made the decision that she had already known she was going to make. She was not going to run forever. She was going to survive tonight and move tomorrow and find Finn, and from Finn find the network, and from the network find a way to do something. Not because she was a queen, the Varath had taken that title from her along with everything else. Because she was a mother, and her children were going to grow up, and she intended them to grow up in a world where that column of smoke was a memory and not a permanent condition. She blew out the small light she'd allowed herself and lay down with her children, and slept for 4 hours with both eyes closed. The Varath species did not have a word for stubbornness. This was not a cultural oversight. They had simply never evolved a concept for it, because for the Varath, strategic recalculation in the face of superior force was not only logical but morally correct. The idea that a living organism might choose continued resistance against overwhelming odds out of sheer refusal to accept the arithmetic was, to the Varath mind, equivalent to a machine running on corrupted code. It was a malfunction. It was to be corrected. Sector Commander Vreth 4 had been assigned to the elimination of the former Tessevar governance structure as a straightforward administrative task. The province had been pacified. The symbolic figurehead of the old order, this queen, this Solène, was a loose end rather than a threat. Her capture or confirmed death would allow full administrative integration to proceed. Vreth 4 had allocated 3 days and a standard 6-unit ground team to the operation. On the 4th day, when the ground team reported no confirmed contact, he allocated 2 additional teams and aerial reconnaissance. On the 7th day, when aerial reconnaissance reported nothing but forest and thermal noise, he requested a secondary perimeter deployment. On the 14th day, Vreth 4 stood in the operations center of the administrative cruiser holding orbit over Sector 9 Kale and reviewed the data again. The woman and her 3 children had walked out of the 12-kilometer sweep radius on foot through dense forest without leaving thermal traces that his equipment could lock onto. His analysts had reviewed the footage 17 times. They had no explanation. The explanation was that Mara had wrapped her children in layers of emergency thermal sheeting, and moved them exclusively in the 3-hour window each night, when Vareth orbital sensors were in their recalibration cycle. Information she'd obtained from her husband, who had spent 2 years before his death carefully documenting Vareth patrol and monitoring patterns from the roof of their provincial house, with instruments disguised as weather equipment. Tomas had left her more than a note. He had left her a manual. She'd found the second cache, the one with the data chip, on day 3 of their walk, in exactly the location he'd described on a second handwritten sheet tucked beneath the protein containers. She transferred the chip's contents to a salvaged reading device she'd bartered from a forest trapper, Fenn's cousin, as it turned out, which was not a coincidence, and spent the nights while her children slept memorizing patrol cycles, sensor ranges, communication frequencies, and the organizational structure of the Vareth administrative garrison in the Eastern Valley. By the time she reached Fenn's operation on day 4, she was not arriving as a refugee. She was arriving as a briefing. Fenn was a large, practical woman with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular manner of someone who had survived a long time by making accurate assessments quickly. She took one look at Mara standing in her warehouse doorway with a toddler on her hip, a silent 11-year-old behind her, and an 8-year-old who was currently providing a detailed verbal summary of their journey through the forest, including estimated distances and notable features of the route systems, and said, "You're alive." "I'm aware," Mara said. "They've got the whole eastern grid on alert. 3 additional units deployed from the orbital." "I know, I've counted them." Mara set Lena down on a crate, looked at Finn directly. "I need to talk to the network. I have Tomas's data." Finn went still. She'd known Tomas. She'd respected him, which was not the same thing as liking him, though she'd done that too. How complete. 3 years of observation. Patrol cycles for the Eastern Garrison going back to the annexation. Communications architecture. Staffing rotation schedules. 2 known weaknesses in the sensor perimeter they haven't patched. Mara paused. And the location of their secondary fuel processing node, which is apparently built on a geological fault they didn't survey properly. Fenn stared at her for a long moment. "He spent a lot of time on the roof," Mara said. She stayed with Fenn for 3 weeks. This was not because it was safe. It was less dangerous than the forest, but the Vareth were still sweeping, and a woman with 3 children in a supply warehouse required explanation if anyone came checking. It was because 3 weeks was how long it took to establish the contacts, verify the network, and build the operational framework that Mara had decided was necessary before she moved. Alden helped in the warehouse during the day, learning the supply chain faster than even Fenn expected, developing a near-photographic memory for inventory that Fenn put to immediate use. She was not a child who needed to be kept ignorant of what was happening. She was a child who had watched her father buried in 40 seconds and then walked 4 days through a forest, and had already done the arithmetic on what her family was. She asked precise questions and received precise answers, and did not ask for comfort she did not believe was available. Corin befriended every person who came through the warehouse, which was not a small number. He had his father's quality of making people feel immediately known, an instinctive warmth that cut through caution the way a well-placed question cuts through a silence. Within a week, the drivers, the traders, and the backroom contacts who rotated through Fenn's operation were bringing Corin small things, a carved piece of wood, a packet of something sweet, a piece of information mentioned casually that was actually a great deal more than casual. Fenn noticed this and said nothing, because useful information was useful information regardless of its vector. Lena did not speak for the first 2 weeks, not one word. On the 16th day, she climbed into Mara's lap in the early morning before the others were awake, tucked her head under her mother's chin, and said in a voice like a small stone dropped in still water, "Is Daddy gone, or is he somewhere else?" Mara held her daughter and was very quiet for a moment. "He's somewhere else," she said. I don't know exactly where, but somewhere, and he can see us. Can he see we're okay? Yes. Okay, Lena was quiet for another moment. Then, I'm hungry. I'll make breakfast. Can I help? Yes, Mara said. You can always help. After that, Lena talked. She talked a great deal. She had apparently stored up 2 weeks' worth of observations about everything she'd seen, which she now delivered in a continuous and remarkably detailed stream. Fenn said, after 4 days of this, that Lena was going to be terrifying when she grew up. Mara said she was counting on it. The network contact arrived on day 19 in the form of a man named David, who introduced himself as a supply coordinator and was very obviously not that. He had the particular quality of alertness of someone who had spent years in situations where inattention was fatal, and he looked at Mara with the expression of a person who had heard something they didn't entirely believe and was now reconciling it against the evidence. I was told you had Tomas Solen's operational data, he said. You were told correctly. I was also told you have an assessment and a proposal. I do. Most people who come to us from a direct Varath action come looking for extraction, David said. Not an accusation, an observation. I don't want extraction, Mara said. He looked at her for a moment. What do you want? The Varath have been in this sector for 7 years, Mara said. In 7 years they have not made a single strategic error. They don't make strategic errors. They are not built for it. They plan with a precision that is genuinely impressive, and they execute those plans with a consistency that borders on the mechanical. She paused. But they have made one persistent mistake, which is that they believe human resistance is a computational problem rather than a character problem. They keep expecting us to run the numbers and stop. David said nothing. The weakness in the sensor perimeter that Tomas documented isn't a gap they accidentally left. It's a gap they left deliberately. It has a kill zone behind it. They're using it as a funnel for anyone trying to move through. It's a trap. She spread Tomas's data on the table between them. But the kill zone is staffed by a unit from the secondary garrison, and that unit rotates on a 7-day cycle. There is a 6-hour window every rotation where the kill zone is being handed off between units. During that window, it is staffed at minimum capacity. David looked at the data. You've verified this. Fenn has 3 drivers who run that eastern corridor. The rotation has been consistent for 14 months. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, Mara could hear Corin explaining something to one of the warehouse drivers with great enthusiasm. She caught the phrase root system diameter and surmised he was still processing the forest. This would get people through the perimeter, David said finally, but they'd see the pattern after the first use. Yes, which is why you use it once for the right thing. Mara pointed to the second section of Tomas's data, the fuel processing node. If someone reaches it during the handoff window, and if it's properly compromised, the Eastern Garrison loses primary power generation for an estimated 4 to 6 weeks, during which time their sensor network runs on backup cells, which reduces their tracking range by 60%. She met David's eyes. 60% is the difference between a search radius of 12 kilometers and a search radius of 5 kilometers. That's a lot of people who were unfindable before who can start moving. The silence stretched. How many people do you need? David asked. 3, Mara said, and one of them is me. David argued about her going personally. Fenn argued about her going personally. Alden, who was present for the argument because Mara did not keep things from her daughter, argued about her going personally. The arguments were good ones. She was identifiable, she was a target, she had 3 children, she was the one who held the operational data in her head, and if she was captured the data died with her. Mara listened to all of them. Then she explained why she was going anyway. You need someone who has spent 3 years memorizing this data. You need someone who grew up in this province and knows the terrain. You need someone who the network can confirm has a direct personal reason for not getting caught. She looked around at them. That's me. I'm also the only person in this room Tomas trusted enough to hide 2 caches from and a data chip for. He built this operation for me. I'm going to use it. She paused. And I'm going because my children are going to hear about this someday. And I want the story to be the right story. Alden looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, with the quiet of someone accepting a weight they've decided to carry, "Come back." "I will," Mara said, and meant it the way you mean things when you have already decided nothing else is acceptable. They moved on day 23, during the handoff window, through the gap in the eastern perimeter that looked like a gap, but had been a trap until 3 nights earlier, when Fenn's drivers had confirmed the rotation schedule and Davith's team had quietly neutralized the kill zone's minimum capacity crew in a way that left no evidence of a deliberate action. Mara moved with 2 network operatives, a man named Rael, who was very young and very good at moving through dark spaces, and a woman named Yaris, who was a trained demolitions engineer from before the annexation, and who carried Tomas's geological survey data on the processing node's fault line with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this particular piece of information for a long time. The forest at night, Mara knew. She had spent 3 weeks learning its rhythms, the specific way the wind moved through the canopy, the acoustic shadow created by the old-growth root formations, the patches of thermal reflective lichen that scattered sensor returns. She moved through it the way Tomas's notes had taught her to move through it, and the 2 operatives followed her without question because she moved like she knew exactly where she was going. She did know exactly where she was going. She had been going here since the moment she picked up her youngest child and ran. The Vareth fuel processing node was built into the hillside of the eastern valley, half sunk into the rock, its intake and output feeds running into the valley's power grid like veins from a buried heart. From the outside it looked like a maintenance structure, low, utilitarian, deliberately unimpressive. The Vareth were good at making their infrastructure look like background. It was part of how they held territory. They didn't plant flags, they built fixtures, and after a few years the human population stopped seeing them as occupiers and started seeing them as infrastructure, and removing infrastructure felt irrational. Tomas had seen it differently. He'd surveyed that hillside from 4 different angles over 2 years and noted something the Vareth's own geological team had apparently missed. The fault line running diagonally under the eastern wall of the node was not a minor surface feature. It was a stress fracture that ran 40 meters into the hillside, along exactly the angle where the node's main coupling mechanism was embedded. A precision disruption at the fault's key point would not just damage the coupling, it would compromise the rock formation around it, triggering a structural shift that would take the eastern wall in with it. Yaris had looked at this survey data for approximately 6 seconds before saying, with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose professional life had been building toward a specific moment, "Oh, that's beautiful." They were in the node's service access corridor when the Vareth team arrived. Mara heard them before she saw them, 3 sets of footsteps on the metal access grating, 60 meters behind and closing, and the specific high-frequency carrier tone of an active tracking unit. She held up a fist. Rael and Yaris went still. The tracking unit had not locked onto them. It was running a perimeter sweep, the kind of routine check that automated schedules produced regardless of actual threat assessment. She had exactly the same problem she'd had in the forest in the first hours after the village. She was inside the sweep radius, and she needed to not be, and she had a narrow window to make that happen. She looked at the corridor layout. She looked at where Yaris needed to be. She looked at the 2 ventilation access points on either side of the passage. She turned to Rael and made 3 silent hand signals that Davith had spent 4 hours drilling into them before they left. Separate, draw, hold. Rael looked at her. He was young and he was good at his work, but he had the momentary flash of someone who does not like a plan that puts someone else in front of something dangerous. Mara held his gaze and did not look away, and what she put in her eyes was not bravado. It was the exact, calibrated knowledge of what she was doing and why, and the specific stillness of someone who has already made peace with the risk. He moved. She moved the other way. Yaris, who had already understood, was already moving toward the fault point. What followed was not a firefight. Mara did not have weapons and had no intention of having a firefight. What followed was a navigation problem, which was the kind of problem she was good at. She moved through the secondary ventilation passage with her back flat against the wall and her breathing controlled. The thermal sheeting she'd brought from Fenn's warehouse wrapped around her torso, and she made noise, deliberately, carefully, at exactly the intervals that a poorly trained infiltrator might make, just enough to keep the tracking unit oriented toward her position. The Vareth team followed the sound signature. She had 4 minutes, which was what Yaris had asked for. She counted to herself the way she'd counted the 5 minutes in the forest on the first night. 1, 2, 3. Not fast, not panicked, 1 breath per count. Somewhere in the dark corridor, she thought about Tomas. Not about losing him, about knowing him, about the specific look on his face when he was explaining something he found genuinely beautiful, which was the same look Alden got when she found a solution to a problem she'd been working. The look that meant I see how this fits together. He'd had that look when he showed her the geological survey. She'd teased him about the look and he'd said, without embarrassment, some things are just elegant. She had not understood at the time how much he had built for her, how carefully and over how many years. How the roof and the instruments and the note and the caches and the data chip and the second handwritten sheet were all one continuous act of love expressed in the language of preparation, which was the language he'd had and which she'd never properly valued until she needed it. She counted the last seconds. The node shook. It was not an explosion in the spectacular sense. Yaris was too good for spectacular, too precise. It was a sharp concussive crack, followed by the distinctive groan of stressed rock deciding to finish a fracture it had started 40 years ago. And then the eastern wall of the node went inward with a low roar that felt more geological than industrial. The lights in the corridor dropped to emergency level, amber, minimal, and the tracking unit's carrier tone cut off mid-sweep. The Vareth team behind her had stopped moving. She turned around. In the data, Tomas had written 1 paragraph that she'd read 6 times. It was in the middle of the technical survey, misplaced seeming, as if he'd dropped it in accidentally. She'd come to understand that nothing in those notes was accidental. The Vareth problem, he had written, is not that they're more powerful than us. It's that they believe the gap is fundamental, that our capacity is fixed while theirs scales upward indefinitely. They don't account for the possibility that humans don't approach problems from a position of fixed capacity. We approach them from a position of escalating commitment, and those 2 things are not equivalent. Escalating commitment in the face of superior force looks like madness from a fixed capacity perspective. From the inside, it just feels like being a parent. She had thought about that paragraph on the walk to the forest. She had thought about it in the shelter with her sleeping children. She had thought about it in Fenn's warehouse while Lena asked about her father. She thought about it now, standing in an amber-lit corridor in a half-collapsed Vareth fuel processing node, with 3 Vareth soldiers 40 meters away adjusting to a situation their tactical planning had not anticipated. She was a woman who had been running for 23 days with 3 children through hostile terrain, who had no weapons, who had memorized her dead husband's operational notes, and who had just participated in knocking out the Eastern Garrison's primary power generation. She was tired, and she missed her family, and she had rope burns on her palms from a climb she'd done 2 hours ago, and she had not eaten since before midnight. She was also exactly where she decided to be, doing exactly what she decided to do, and every step between the smoking village and this corridor had been deliberate. The Vareth team came around the corner and found her standing in the amber light looking at them with the specific expression of someone who is not afraid, and is also not trying to appear unafraid, and is instead simply present. They had protocols for resistance combatants. They had protocols for fleeing targets. They did not have a clean protocol for a woman standing still in a corridor looking at them with the quality of attention you give something when you're waiting for it to finish. Rail came through the ventilation access behind them 2 seconds later. He was good at his work. They were out of the valley and into the forest by the time the Vareth emergency response reached the node. Mara moved fast through the dark, through the corridors of root and canopy she had learned to read, through the thermal scatter zones and the acoustic shadows, with Rail at her left and Yaris already running contingency calculations in her head. Behind them, the valley lit up with emergency lighting, and the sound of Vareth coordination protocols broadcasting on frequencies that Tomas's data had labeled precisely, which meant she could listen to them without them knowing she was listening. They were frustrated. She could hear it not in words, because the Vareth did not communicate frustration through inflection the way humans did, but in the compression of their protocols, the clipped efficiency of their coordination traffic, the particular quality of a command structure running on data it can't fully explain. They did not understand what had happened. They would, eventually. They were not stupid. But right now, in this hour, the most powerful military force in the occupied Outer Ring was searching a dark forest for a woman who knew the forest better than their sensors did, and the Eastern garrison was running on backup cells, and 60% of their tracking range was gone. She ran through the trees and thought about her children. She arrived at Finn's warehouse 4 hours before dawn. Alden was awake. This was not a surprise. She was sitting on a crate near the warehouse door with her father's jaw set and her mother's stillness around her like weather. And when she saw Mara come through the door, she stood up and crossed the space between them and put her arms around her mother with the contained intensity of someone who has been waiting in a state of managed fear and has just been released from it. Mara held her daughter. Corin appeared 30 seconds later from behind a stack of supply containers where he had apparently been cataloging something in the dark, because Corin processed fear with activity. He launched into a detailed verbal summary of everything that had happened in the warehouse during their absence, which included 3 new contacts who had arrived through the network, a shipment irregularity that he and Alden had identified and correctly flagged, and the precise number of protein packets they had consumed, which he presented as a ratio of remaining stock with a note on resupply requirements. Lena came out last, walking with deliberate dignity from the back room where she'd been asleep, wearing a too large jacket that belonged to Finn, and carrying a small piece of carved wood that one of the drivers had given her. She regarded her mother with the serious assessment of a 3-year-old who has decided that relief is acceptable. "You're back," Lena said. "I'm back," Mara said. "I knew you would be." "Did you?" "Yes." Lena held out the piece of carved wood. "I saved you some." Finn said it was called a *trestle* tree from before the renaming. Mara took the piece of wood and held it. It was smooth and dark, and it smelled of the old forest, and it had the shape of nothing in particular, which was sometimes the shape things needed to be. "Thank you," she said. The impact of the node operation was not immediate. These things rarely were. The Eastern Garrison's backup power ran the sensor network at reduced capacity for 31 days before their repair crews managed a partial restoration. 11 days longer than Tomas's estimate, because the geological damage had been more extensive than even Yaris's precision had anticipated. During those 31 days, 47 people moved through the Eastern Valley perimeter who would not have been able to move before. 22 of them were families with children. Davith reported this to Mara on the 3rd week, in the matter-of-fact way he reported all things, and she nodded and thought about what Tomas would have said. He would have said the number was good, but the system needed to be better than one operation. He would have already been thinking about the next thing. She was already thinking about the next thing. The network grew. Not explosively. Mara was suspicious of explosive growth, the way she was suspicious of any plan that depended on things going perfectly. It grew the way the old-growth forest grew, slowly, with deep roots, in ways that were not visible until they were substantial. She worked through Fenn and Davith, and through the contacts that Corin had in 3 weeks of warehouse conversations, managed to develop with the specificity of a natural-born intelligence officer. She worked through the data Tomas had left her, and through the information she gathered herself, and through the growing understanding of the Varath administrative structure that came from watching it long enough to see its patterns. The Varath were very good at planning and very good at execution. They were not good at revision. They had been in this sector for 7 years without serious opposition and had built operational assumptions on that fact. And operational assumptions, once built, became structural. They were not prepared for an opponent who revised continuously, who treated every action as information, who had children to put to bed, and therefore had extremely strong opinions about what was worth risking and what wasn't. Mara had extremely strong opinions about what was worth risking. She did not risk herself unnecessarily. She was not reckless. She was the mother of 3 children who needed her and the operational center of a network that was beginning to matter, and she treated her own survival as a resource to be managed rather than a gamble to be taken. But she was not passive. She had never been passive. The difference between running and fleeing was intentionality, and she had decided on the first night in the forest that she was not fleeing. She was moving toward something. The Varath deployed Commander Vreth 4 an additional unit in month 3, after the second operation, a communications disruption that Tomas's frequency data had made possible, and which had temporarily blinded the garrison's coordination with the orbital platform. The commander's report to the Dominion Administrative Authority, reviewed later, used the phrase anomalous persistence to describe the human resistance activity in Sector 9 Kale. In the clinical bureaucratic language of Varath administration, this was the closest they had to an expression of puzzlement. They could not calculate her. They knew she was one woman. Eventually they confirmed this, through informant networks they believed were more secure than they were, networks that Corin's warehouse friendships had quietly penetrated in ways no analyst would have thought to look for. They knew she had children. They knew she was operating from a mobile position rather than a fixed base. They had 317 data points on her activities and 0 data points on her location. Vreth 4 ran the calculations repeatedly. The calculations said she should have been extracted or captured or killed. The calculations said a woman with 3 children and no military training and a provincial administrative background was not a viable long-term resistance asset. The calculations said that grief and anger and stubbornness were not strategic resources. Vreth 4 was beginning to have uncomfortable thoughts about the calculations. Month 7. Mara was in a farmhouse in the Middle Valley with Lena asleep against her shoulder and Alden across the table running network contact schedules, with the systematic focus of someone who had spent 7 months developing a skill and was now genuinely good at it. Corin was somewhere in the house making friends with the farmer's family, which would result in 4 or 5 useful pieces of information by morning, and also very probably a surplus of dried fruit that he somehow always managed to acquire. Davith sat across from her with the look of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "The network out of the northern settlements has made contact," he said. "They want to talk coordination." Mara nodded. "They know who you are," Davith said. "They know the node operation. They know the communications disruption. They're calling you the, he paused, with the slight discomfort of someone delivering a name they didn't choose. The Tess of our queen. Mara looked at him. I know, he said. I'm not a queen, she said. I was a provincial administrator who got a title because the old governance structure required one. I grew up in a valley about 30 kilometers from here. I know, David said again. She was quiet for a moment. Lena shifted in her sleep, curled tighter, made a small sound. Tell them yes, Mara said. But tell them the name has to go. What should I tell them to call you? She thought about Tomas's note. She thought about Lena's piece of carved wood, which she still carried in her left pocket. She thought about Alden moving with a soldier's quiet at 11 years old, and Corin building intelligence networks out of dried fruit and genuine warmth, and Lena who had not spoken for 2 weeks and then come back loud and certain and impossible. Tell them, Mara said, to call me by my name. The thing the Vareth never understood, not Vreth IV, not the administrative authority, not the 3 commanders who replaced him in the years that followed, was that Mara Solen was not the operation. She was the reason for the operation. The operation was everywhere. It was in the drivers who moved through Fenn's eastern corridor and learned its rhythms and taught them to others. It was in the farmhouses and the forest caches and the warehouse contacts and the supply chain irregularities that turned out to be movement corridors for people who needed to move. It was in the 47 people who crossed the perimeter in the first 31 days and the hundreds who followed them. It was in Alden, who was 16 now and ran a coordination cell with 3 assets and 0 unnecessary losses. It was in Corin, who could walk into any room of strangers and walk out with 2 friends, a useful piece of information, and an inexplicable amount of dried fruit. It was in Lena, who was 9 years old and had not spoken for 2 weeks after watching a column of smoke rise over a burning village, and who had come back anyway, loud and certain, and carrying a piece of wood from a tree that was named after the world that used to exist. The Vareth were very good at calculating threats. They were not good at calculating families. They kept looking for the Resistance's fixed point, its leader, its base, its core. The thing that, if you removed it, the structure collapsed. They found Mara twice in 3 years and failed to capture her twice in 3 years, and each time they failed they were genuinely confused, because their models said the mathematics should have worked, and the mathematics kept not working, and they could not understand why. The why was that Mara was not the fixed point. The network was the fixed point, and the network was people, and people were not a calculation. People were the specific weight of a sleeping child against your shoulder. People were a note on a handwritten sheet that said asterisk you already know what to do. People were an 11-year-old girl who moved like a soldier because she had decided to, and an 8-year-old boy who made friends the way some people make fire, instinctively, necessarily, leaving warmth everywhere he went. People were a 3-year-old who was silent for 2 weeks and then came back talking. People were the thing the Vareth had never learned to calculate. 5 years after the burning of the village, the Vareth Administrative Authority issued, for the first time since the annexation, a security assessment of Sector 9 that classified the province as asterisk operationally unstable. In Vareth administrative language, this was a significant designation. It meant that standard pacification protocols had not produced expected outcomes. It meant that resource allocation had exceeded projections by a factor of 3. It meant that the sector was not functioning as infrastructure. It meant, though no Vareth administrator would have used these words, that the humans were winning. Mara sat in a farmhouse that was not the same farmhouse as 5 years ago. They moved regularly, a habit so deeply ingrained that her children had developed a precise and practiced system for packing and departing in under 40 minutes, and read the intercepted assessment with the same stillness she brought to all things. Alden was across the table. She was 16, and she had her father's jaw in her mother's eyes, and she was running 3 assets and a coordination cell, and she read the assessment over Mara's shoulder and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "It's not enough." "No," Mara said. "We need the northern network and the valley contacts to move at the same time." "Yes, if we time it with the orbital recalibration cycle." "We've been timing things with the orbital recalibration cycle for 5 years. They'll adjust for it." Alden was quiet for a moment. "Then we use a different window." "Yes," Mara said, "we do." She looked at her daughter. Alden looked back at her. There was so much that had been lost. Tomas was 5 years in the soil of a village that no longer had its name. The life they'd had, the provincial house, the routines, the specific ordinary comfort of a life that was theirs, was memory now, polished smooth by the frequency of recollection. Mara was 41 years old and had not slept in the same location for more than a week in 5 years. And she was tired in the specific way of someone who has been awake for a very long time and does not intend to stop. None of it was nothing. It was all enormous. It sat in her chest alongside everything else, a weight she had chosen to carry and was still choosing. But across the table was Alden, who had been 11 years old in a forest learning to fold emergency tarps, and who was 16 now and thinking 3 steps ahead, and who was her father's jaw and her mother's eyes and her own specific self, who had decided to be exactly who she was. And from the back of the farmhouse came Corin's voice, bright and unstoppable, talking someone through something with the particular enthusiasm he brought to things he found genuinely fascinating. And on the floor near the door, with her back against the wall and her legs stretched out, was Lena, now 9, reading from a data chip with absolute concentration, with the carved piece of wood from the trestle tree in her pocket where she always kept it. Mara had buried her husband on a Tuesday. She had run into a forest with her children and nothing else. And they had grown in that forest, the way things grew in the old deep woods, slowly, with roots deeper than you could see, in the dark, without permission, without stopping, toward whatever light was available. She looked at Alden. "Show me the window," she said. And they went back to work. What the Varath Dominion would eventually record, in the dry administrative language of an authority that had not yet fully processed its own reversal, was that Sector 9Kale proved the most resource-intensive pacification effort in the Dominion's Outer Ring history. What their historians would later note, in assessments that circulated internally and were not meant to be seen, was that the destabilization of the sector originated with a single woman, operating from mobile positions, with 3 children, with no military training, using data compiled by her deceased husband and a network built from supply chain contacts and a warehouse in the Eastern Valley. What they could not adequately explain, in the dry language of administrative assessment, was how. The how was not tactical. The how was not strategic. The how was the specific character of a person who had decided, at the bottom of a forest night with 5 minutes counted on her fingers, that the story she left her children needed to be the right story, who had looked at grief and exhaustion and impossible arithmetic and said, "Still," who had looked at the Varath Dominion's absolute conviction that this was a calculation problem and said, quietly from a farmhouse that moved every week, "It is not." The how was that she was a mother. And mothers, in the long cold record of every species the Dominion had ever encountered, were the one thing that consistently refused to behave like a calculation. Mara Solen never got the village back. She never got Tomas back. She never got the ordinary life, the provincial house, the Tuesdays that were just Tuesdays rather than the day everything changed. What she got was this: a world where her children grew up, a network that outlasted the Dominion's patience and then its resources and then its willingness to keep spending on a sector that should have been simple. A name that spread through the outer ring, not Tessevar Queen, because she had refused that, but Mara, plain and specific and spoken in exactly the tone of voice people use when they mean, "It is possible." An old piece of carved wood in her daughter's pocket, from a tree named after a world that they were slowly, root by root, bringing back. And on the last night before the offensive that would finally break the eastern garrison, the night before the simultaneous operations, the north and the valley, the window they had found together, she sat with her 3 children in the farmhouse, and they were quiet for a while, which was rare, and the quiet felt like something that had been earned. Lena took the piece of wood out of her pocket and turned it over in her fingers. "Trestle," she said. "Yes," Mara said. "Is that what we're calling it when it's back?" Myra looked at her daughter, looked at all 3 of them, Alden with her jaw set and her eyes clear, Corin with the half-smile of someone who already knows this is going to work, Lena turning the dark smooth wood in her fingers. "Yes," she said, "Tessivar, we're calling it what it was." Outside, the night was deep and the old forest stood against the dark, roots going down 40 meters, canopy locked overhead so the sky came in pieces. Inside, the lantern made a warm circle, and within the circle sat a woman who had buried her husband on a Tuesday and run into the dark with her children, and had not stopped running, not toward safety, not away from pain, but toward the specific future she had decided her family deserved. The Varath Dominion had 700 ships in the outer ring. They had sensor networks and administrative cruisers and a generation of unbroken conquest. They had everything, except the thing she had, which was the knowledge, bone-deep and unargued, that she would still be here in the morning, that her children would still be here, that the roots of the old forest went down farther than any sensor had reached, and that she had been learning its shape for 5 years, and that tomorrow, when the window opened, she would move through it the way she always moved, with her eyes open, her mind clear, and the specific, absolute, unmathematical certainty of a mother who has decided that the story ends differently. She pressed her thumb to the inside of her wrist, where the bracelet had been. "Get some sleep," she told her children. Alden nodded once, the way her father used to nod. Corin said he wasn't tired, which meant he was. Lena put the piece of wood back in her pocket and closed her eyes. Mara sat with them until all 3 were breathing slow and even. Then she picked up the operational data and went back to work, and the lantern burned small in the dark, and the forest stood all around them in the night, and in the morning they would begin.